Oh. What does a world without HIV look like? How do you think you would love or have sex if HIV never existed? These are just some of the questions we'll be talking about today for our second installment of We Shall Not Be Removed, the state of HIV in Black, gay, and bisexual male communities. This series is brought to you today by AIDS United, a Washington, D.C. based institution dedicated to ending the AIDS epidemic in the United States through technical assistance, policy and advocacy, formative research, and capacity building assistance. My name is Yolo Keeley Robinson, and I will be your moderator today. I am also a capacity building trainer at AIDS United. For those of you who are following the conversation today on social media, you can tweet us at AIDS_United. You can also like us on Facebook as well. For the later half of this conversation, we will actually have an opportunity to tweet and also post comments on Facebook that we will take as questions and present them to our panelists. All right, so make sure you follow us, stay engaged, and get involved in the conversation. Now we can move on to, of course, to have this conversation today. We have a distinguished panel of gentlemen. Been very excited to have these guys on here today. So let me take some time to introduce everyone. First off, I want to introduce Dr. Errol Fields. Dr. Fields, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
Dr. Errol Fields is an assistant professor in the Division of General Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. His research focuses on using mixed methodologies to understand and reduce racial disparities in HIV among adolescent and young adults, Black, gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men. We're really glad to have Dr. Fields with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. Next, we have Dr. David Malebranche. Say hi, Dr. Malebranche, please.
Hey, everybody.
Dr. Malebranche is a clinician researcher with expertise in the clinical management of HIV and behavioral HIV prevention research with Black men in the United States. He is currently a primary care physician at the University of Pennsylvania's Student Health Center in Philadelphia. He's also experienced qualitative HIV behavioral prevention researcher who's completed several studies on sexual health among Black men of diverse sexualities. And we're happy to have you. Thank you so much, Dr. Malebranche, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Last but certainly not least, we have, I was going to say Dr. Darnell Moore. Darnell Moore. Say hi, Darnell.
Hi, everybody.
Darnell Moore is a writer and educator based in Brooklyn, New York. He's a senior editor at Mike News and the co-managing partner of the Feminist Wire. He is a member of the Africana Studies faculty at Vassar College and is the co-founder of You Belong, and we're really thrilled to have him with us today. Thank you for joining us, Darnell. Thank you.
Glad to be part.
Awesome. So let's get started with our conversation. Today's conversation, like I said once before, it focuses on talking about HIV and love and intimacy. How does HIV and HIV stigma specifically influence the way that we as Black men of color, MSM, Black, gay, bisexual, shame, gender loving men, how we love, how we engage intimacy, and how we engage trust? So first question I want to pose for you all, and then just to kind of get the conversation going, is I want to actually share a story of a time in which HIV status or HIV and AIDS stigma impacted a relationship that you had, whether it was a professional relationship, a personal relationship, a family member, anytime that you felt like the stigma created a challenge for you in your relationships. And I'm going to go on a wing here and give this one to Dr. Malebranche first. Is that okay?
Thanks.
Yes.
You know what? Y'all are a mess. I mean, I can't remember a time where HIV wasn't kind of a part of the landscape and part of the stigma. Like, I was a teenager when HIV started kind of taking its hold on everybody. So it's affected me in personal and professional ways. Obviously, it's been instrumental because in the 80s and 90s, I had a lot of friends who were testing positive. I was medical school and residency in the late 90s when the medications were started, and so there's a lot of stigma. I got involved in HIV because while working at Grady Hospital in Atlanta, I remember actually staff members at Grady Hospital treating people who were living with HIV like they were lepers. They double and triple glove. They'd kind of roll their eyes at them, suck their teeth. Nurses would choose not to do certain things with patients because they were worried they were going to get infected, even though they knew how it was transmitted. And I got interested in the field obviously because I felt I could do it better, and I could see and hear the stigma from the medical profession was affecting people in the hospitals, as well as personally. I was getting tested every 3 to 6 months as I was sexually active, and I had a lot of friends who were testing positive. Some were on medication, some weren't. Some were at different stages. So for me, the stigma has always been a part of it because it's for the past 15 to 20 years.
Absolutely.
So actually, I can take the next. I can take the next response, I guess. Can you all still hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So I had actually been working in HIV prevention for probably about 5 or 6 years before someone that was close to me was affected by HIV, and so it's interesting because until that time I had thought about HIV from a very academic perspective. I mean, I was really focused on prevention, focused on care, and obviously was moved by the stories I heard from people that I worked with professionally, but it still was something that was very academic for me until a few friends of mine told me about their own status, and then it just became a much more real. It just became much realer to me. And previously, when the work that I had done was really kind of cerebrally focused, it now became something that was became more passionate about it just because I had some personal perspective on it at that point.
Wow.
For me, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I had HIV up until about my late teens, early 20s was sort of like a ghost that haunted the presence of a lot of my friends' lives, mine too. So we heard about HIV, but rarely had I been in contact with folk who had been very open about their status until a person who I was really close to and had also been sexually intimate with had showed up at my house once to tell me that he was HIV positive, and I remember us crying together. I had to be about 19 or 20, and we literally sat in my closet in my apartment and cried for about 2 hours, partly because of the guilt that I felt for him discovering his status. He had been introduced to, I guess you would call the gay scene or gay and queer life through me. And I felt guilty that he, in the course of that time, had contracted HIV, and I didn't. And secondly, I was, I guess, floored because we had been sexually intimate for quite some time. So it made, I don't know if it changed me, if in as much as it just made HIV real, and yeah, quite real and felt in my own life, and it shifted the way I sort of thought about HIV after that.
Wow. Well, thank you all for sharing. Kind of going more in depth with this question, because Darnell, you brought in the piece about having a personal experience, and David and Errol, you've been working in the field and in research and also working with clients for a very long time. When you think about this piece about bringing it out of an academic context, right? Talking about specifically the emotional quality of it. How do you see in the context of your research, even, or have you experienced the emotional aspect of HIV stigma and how it influences trust? How has that impacted anything that you've seen in your research? Okay, but got you. Okay, you're back.
Good. I mean, yeah, in the research, obviously, I've interviewed a lot of brothers who have talked about not so much the interpersonal relationships, but then also kind of the medical profession and kind of some of the stigma they've experienced from providers and from staff. And also on top of that, some of the qualitative research I've done, I know Errol's done as well, has looked at some of the stigma in relationships and what people are kind of dealing with at a certain time. And I think it's different now than it was like 10, 15 years ago. It's different now than it was even like 3 to 4 years ago because of the advent of PrEP and kind of the way that's happening. I think it's changed about how we are relating to each other, how we are intimate with each other. I think for me on a personal level, was also something that hit me because, you know, up to about 2007, I had been working in the field. I had been doing research. I had counseled, I can't even count how many friends and colleagues and other people who had tested positive. And then I tested positive myself in 2007. And at that point, it was kind of what Darnell said. It wasn't one of those things where it changed my attitude, it didn't change my empathy towards it. It just made it more real. And I think it kind of uncovered a lot of things that I had been ignoring in my life, how I was responding to stress, how I was doing other things like that. So I think the silver lining on it was that it kind of flipped something on its end and made me see things from a much more nuanced perspective. And then kind of understand firsthand when people would say to me, you know what, I can't disclose to somebody because I'm fearful that I'm going to be rejected. And, you know, that hadn't been a part of my repertoire before. I hadn't experienced that on a personal level, and then I was faced with it. And it doesn't matter whether, you know, you're undetectable or on medications or the other person is on PrEP. When that discussion comes up, when one partner is positive and one is negative, there is always the chance it's going to be that that negative partner will not want to, you know, get with the person who's positive.
Well, you finished, David? I'm sorry, I think you went out for a minute.
So for me, all stigma is still very real, but I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. You just broke up for a moment.
Yeah, but I'm saying what's important at this point in time is that the advent of PrEP and Truvada and those kind of things, treatment is prevention, the things that we know are working, are actually very, very helpful in having these conversations so that people can experience love and intimacy and not be browbeat over the head with this condom message all the time, particularly for a lot of people who haven't enjoyed using condoms or prefer not to use condoms. There's much more freedom and a little less stigma that people can be honest with themselves instead of having to lie to themselves, their partners, the providers, that they don't like using condoms.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, absolutely.
I think one of the things that I've experienced in my clinical work, and I work with younger populations, sort of 13 to 25 or so, and certainly fortunately don't have anybody as young as 13 that's infected, but I've worked with both negative and positive youth, and one of the things that I've noticed recently is that there's been some of the youth that I work with almost see being gay or being same-gender loving or being homosexual as equivalent to eventually becoming positive, and they sort of see the two as one and the same, and don't feel like they have that it's possible for them to have to kind of go on, move forward and live forward and not have eventually be diagnosed with HIV. So that's one of the things that does concern me about how things are now. But even the young people that are infected, they still, even though they seem to think it's sort of an inevitability, and they have a lot more people tend to know more people who are positive now, they still have the stigma that's associated with their diagnosis when they talk to their families, when they talk to their parents, when they talk to their loved ones, and still it's very difficult to have those conversations with potentially intimate partners around that because of the stigma that still exists around HIV. And I think if you go on any of the hookup sites, for instance, you're going to see people talking about their status, but it's almost more of they're talking about their HIV status, but it's almost a status of their it's almost a status symbol to be negative. And I think it sort of puts us in the categories that we've already had, where there's sort of the wanted category and there's the unwanted category. So whether that's top or bottom or masculine or feminine, HIV has become one of those things too. And I think that's the stigma that's associated with HIV creates that dichotomy, and I think we need to work on getting rid of that.
Very powerful. Very powerful. Darnell, I want to bring the conversation to you. I know a lot of your work is centered as well on genders and masculinity, gender and masculinities. How have you experienced in the context of your work when we think about talking about the HIV stigma and the unique ways in which male socialization kind of plays out to how we are connected emotionally, how we connect intimately? How do you see any intersection with those things, or what's been created at the intersection of male socialization and HIV stigma in terms of our ability to build intimacy?
Good question. And I guess briefly, I wanted to offer just one thought as it relates to the last question. And in so many ways, as a person who reads research, and in reading research done by public health professionals, often feel as if, as a black gay man, a same-gender loving man, I'm talked about as a subject and not a human being. I also think that shapes the way in which the research is done, right? So how do you measure pain? How do you measure trauma? How do you measure measure stigma? How do you measure like the deep hurts and even the resiliencies that people have? And how does that show up? How can you make that show up in research, our writings? And in so many ways, it does turn the project into something that's cerebral as opposed to. It's easier, I think, to think through the complications of HIV and its impacts on us as Black folk, as Black men who have sex with men, women, same gender loving folk, than it is to talk about it through the heart. Because when we do that, we have to uncover and deal with all the pain that's associated with it. Mm-hmm. But in relation to sort of malsocialization, I mean, as Black, I'm thinking particularly of Black men anyway, we live in a world that's not kind to Black people any damn way. In an anti-Black world that teaches us to hate ourselves before we learn and have to do the work of loving ourselves, it means we already have some hurdles to cross in terms of our relating to one another as Black folk, as Black men outside of the context of intimacy, sexual intimacy. So when we can get into relationships where sexual intimate or other forms of intimate relationships, we have to like work. We're working and loving as we heal. We're loving even as we're hurting. We're loving and having to teach ourselves how to do all of that, even while we exist like in this system that tells us we're not deserving of it. So HIV, if added to that, becomes just another one of those hurdles that people feel like they need to cross. And one story that comes to mind, a former close friend, partner of mine, after he had, we had talked about statuses, cried in my arms because he had never sat with anyone who was so accepting of him. Like this was and I was in shock, partially because it means nothing to me. Like I don't see status as an entry into a relationship. But for him, who'd been rejected so many times, he had never really sat in front of another Black guy who was like, okay, next question, let's move on. Now, what do you want to eat for dinner? And he broke down in tears in my living room for like 45 minutes. And if that doesn't signal the type of the ways in which rejection and stigma shapes or breaks down our relationships, then I don't know what else does.
Could I say something to add on to that?
Absolutely.
I do think Darnell's point is such a good one, and I think on a lot of levels, and I think kind of intersecting what Errol and Darnell was I mean, obviously, general, regardless of who we decide to love and who we're attracted to at the end of the day. And I think one of the funny things right now about research is that Darnell's absolutely right. And what part of the reason why Errol and myself love doing qualitative research is because we get to actually speak to brothers and have these conversations. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a room full of brothers in a focus group or done a one-on-one interview, and brothers have broken down and cried in these sessions and said, this is the first time anyone's even listened to us. Forget about HIV, forget about all that stuff. It's just a general principle of Black men seen as numbers, seen as threats, seen as all these other things, but not visualized as human beings. And the sad part of it right now is that I just had the honor to work on a paper with a few brilliant brothers, Derek Matthews, Justin Smith, and Andre Brown, on a paper we just submitted for publication that's actually dissecting the current landscape of public health research with Black MSM that's focusing on this kind of notion of sexual networks. And the theory right now is that because Black men, we as Black same gender loving men, tend to partner with each other more than any other race, ethnicity, there's a finding that that's part of the explanation about why HIV is so prevalent of our community. You already have a high background prevalence of HIV, and then if we're engaging in sexual intercourse with predominantly each other, it's just a larger pool through which we can gain exposure. But what's just is instead of like the tried and true traditional individual level saying you're not using condoms enough, you're not using condoms enough, and beating us over the head with that. Now the conversation is you're having sex too much with each other, as if Black men loving Black men by itself is a risk factor for HIV. And although the science will show that the sexual networks are part of that equation, it's not all of the equation, and the messaging that's coming out of it is a very pejorative one, and a one that public health officials have been extremely careless with in messaging and saying, well, Black men are sleeping with each other too much and they tend to sleep with each other more. And I was like, but yeah, but that's a good thing, that we still love each other, that we're still there for each other, that we still are attracted to one another in spite of all these things. So instead of flipping it and say us loving us is a risk factor for disease, why not say us loving us is a wonderful thing? Keep doing it, but be mindful about X, Y, and Z and have these open conversations. And that's what's problematic. And that's why people like myself, Errol, Darnell, and numerous other brothers are like very passionate about this, because if we don't combat that message with a counter narrative, people think that that message is the norm, and all that other masculine socialization that goes on, all that other stuff that's been, you know, plugged into the back of our brains like the Matrix since we were born, now is being compounded with this message of HIV on top of all the stigmas, like Errol was saying, the masculine feminine, the no fats, no femmes, the drug and disease free, the, you know, this is the top or bottom stuff. So it's just another added layer, and we have to constantly fight. That we still.
I'm sorry, you broke up for the last part of that, David. What you?
No, I said in spite of all these obstacles, the focus should be on our resilience. We still love each other. We always still love each other. And the fact that black men were more likely to love each other than any other ethnic group, that should be celebrated. Celebrated.
Yeah.
Ashe, very well said.
Yeah. You know, and that's actually one of the great things about something like PrEP, in that it can, if you're on PrEP, it can sort of reduce your chances of being infected. So if you can continue to be with the people you want to be with, and continue to be with each other regardless of what the prevalence might be, and still be protected from HIV. And I think that's one of the, you know, if the focus on the sexual networks, the focus on that really should be, so how can we identify the particular networks that are at greatest risk, so that we can target individual people who are within those networks, for things like PrEP and for things like testing and treatment as prevention, so that, again, the focus is not on what you individually do. We can lower the risk in this group of people as a whole, and all the different structural factors that create those increased risks. I think PrEP is an amazing tool for being able to do that.
You all brought up so many powerful points that definitely need to be addressed. And one piece I want to pull out from that, and David, Darnell, Errol, you all have touched upon this, is talking about dealing with the trauma and talking about dealing with the emotional health aspect of this work. In the context of, like, you all have been in the HIV and AIDS field doing work, also genders and gender and masculinity work. So how do you see, or do you see, these institutions as agencies really engaging Black MSM in the context of this epidemic around the emotional health and the trauma piece that is really, you know, one of the things, of course, that we're encountering because of the prevalence, because of all the distrust, all these different all the stigma. Do you see institutions engaging and talking about Black MSM, emotional health and trauma, and how that intersects with prevention and care and all those pieces?
So yes and no. I think one of the things that those of us who are in research and academic institutions kind of face is we have to go where the money is, and unfortunately, oftentimes the money is not focused on those things. I mean, it's more focused on the disease outcome for HIV in particular, and other STDs in particular. So we can really make the argument and the story around, really we have to focus on all of those things and kind of the health, the overall health of individuals, if we're going to be able to effectively change any particular disease outcome like HIV. So part of the you know, the struggle really is to make that connection to funders. But I think one of the ways in which we're able to do that, and which I think some people are kind of starting to get, is really to engage the pipeline of researchers, to really include more of us within that dialogue, so that we can really speak from our own experiences, and really have those experiences inform our work and inform the way in which we reach out to the community.
Absolutely.
I don't know. For me, you know, for me as a person who gets to sort of public health research through folk like David and Errol, but never had the privilege of having like a primary care physician like David, who could sort of see me as a human being. It's been in my experience where I don't think that the trauma and emotional impact of this has been adequately dealt with. When I went for testing, when I go to offices, I'm asked sort of a set of preliminary questions that's attempting to get me to think about my sex practices. Never once have anyone set me down to deal with the fact that the first time gayness was linked to Black masculinity or Black manhood was when an aunt told me at 14 that I had another older cousin who was a second cousin whose name was Darnell too. He acted a little feminine, and oh, by the way, he died of AIDS, right? So like I was taught that the black male body was the HIV body. No one ever talked about the trauma of what it meant to deal with that, right? So that meant instantly when I thought about sex, in my mind, I always perceived myself as necessarily, I was like, I'm going to get this anyway. That's what the world is telling me, that this is my lot. So if that was my thought, it meant my sexual practices then, which were based on that. It meant that I didn't really care about protecting myself, using a condom. Because in my mind, I thought, well, this sort of was the self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, who is going to sit with us to talk about that in a doctor's office? The first time a doctor ever talked to me about a test was when he told me that he started reading he started quoting Bible scriptures. Like, so I don't experience anyone, I haven't, as a person who is sort of a recipient of public health services, anyone ever dealing with the emotional impact, psychological impact, spirit impact of HIV in my life, ever.
Powerful. Thank you so much for sharing, Darnell. Very powerful.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think one of the other things that we think about, and my answer to your question about, are we adequately addressing the mental health of black men, and forget about HIV, just before that, we're not doing it. And that's all steeped in kind of issues of masculinity and kind of performance and what we're told to be and how not to cry, and kind of how we are socialized to believe in these things. But it's interesting when you look at like public health and medical fields, and there's a lot of work that like John Rich, who does a lot of rich work on, and he's at Drexel University, has done a lot of rich work on trauma, community violence, and black men. And if you look at kind of what happens in emergency rooms, like if you come in and you're in a condition called diabetic ketoacidosis, like your blood sugar is so high, you're getting acidotic, you have to be admitted to the hospital. What do? They admit you to the hospital, they treat you, they give you diabetic teaching, they give you medications, and they make sure you're kind of followed up and all squared away with all the things that you need. If a brother comes in who's a victim of some kind of violence that's perpetrated, whether it's via a gunshot or something else, what do? They do the surgery, they patch him up, and they send them right back out to the same community where the violence occurred. So if you look at this from a disease model and you look at community violence or trauma as a disease, why would you not provide mental health counseling while in the hospital for someone who just got surgery for being shot? That means, and that speaks to what Errol and Darnell were talking about here, which is kind of like that white people believe that black people, we have a higher threshold for pain. And so we take pain greater than other people. So if a black person complains of pain, you're going to think either they're drug seeking or they're not in as much pain. And so that's a real thing that happens, and that's been documented. So why would you not, with a brother that comes in and gets shot in the leg, you'd fix him up, but you'd also want to have a mental health therapist or a counselor or provide him with research or resources when he goes home to deal with that. Instead, a lot of times we just do the surgery, patch him up, and then send them home. And yet black men, not as human beings, not as visceral, fluid, moving, emotional sources of light, but we look at them as just kind of statistics or people we need to fix and then turf back out. But it would be akin to having somebody who came in end-stage diabetes, just kind of get their numbers correct, not give them any education, not give them any medication, and send them out to a McDonald's to go home. That's what you do. It's the same fucking thing.
Absolutely. Using that point, David and Errol, I really like to engage you both on this piece. Is that, like, I hear very clearly that is, of course, a consequence of the ways in which we relate to in black male bodies. And at the same time, I'm curious to know, from your standpoint, as doctors, as medical doctors, is that something, is the profession, or are MDs trained to necessarily go into that depth, and like, is there any hostility between mental health care services and MDs in those kind of contexts, in those spaces? Because I'm curious, I'm thinking about my medical experiences as well, which have been very kind of like, clinical, fix this, keep it moving, and I'm wondering if that's a question of training sometimes.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I have some minimal involvement with medical student education now, and I can recognize that there's still a huge way to go as far as the amount of training we provide to medical students and trainees about how to take care of patients, how to be culturally competent, how to really engage a person as a person and rather than as a disease entity. There's still a long way to go, but it's certainly a lot better than it was when I was in medical school, which was just about probably about 10 to 12 years ago. And so I think there's been some progress, but I think the bigger issue really has to do with what David was talking about, was that just really being able to see Black men, Black people as humans, to recognize their humanity and see your own humanity within them for the people who are non-African American that are taking care of patients. I think that's one of the biggest the problems that really exist here. I mean, I've seen that again and again. I mean, I think fortunately in pediatrics, which is what I trained in, there is much more a kind of a whole person model. You think about the family, you think about the community where the person comes from, but that's not really the case as much in adult medicine. And I just remember seeing that for the first time, like really seeing that for the first time when I was in medical school. There was a patient that we had on the surgery floor who was there because he had an aortic rupture, so the main artery in his body was going to rupture, so they had to actually repair it quickly. And he was about 30, had a lot of tattoos or whatever. You know, he'd just been in a very scary, kind of emergency surgery, and so he was not smiling and nice to the nursing staff. And really, they sort of treated him as if he were a criminal or someone that wasn't deserving of any type of compassion. And really, he would only, at the end of the time that he was there, he really would only speak to myself and one of the other medical students who could. The other medical student was a Caucasian female, so it wasn't really a race thing. It was just a matter of we both, I think, because we hadn't been jaded for whatever reason, and because we both had the compassion to really be able to interact with somebody as though they were a human and not just somebody that's in a hospital bed, we were able to connect with him. But I think so much of the time, most people are not able to do that. And to give it a little bit of benefit of the doubt, I think a lot of us, and this kind of speaks to a little bit of what I was talking about earlier, that a lot of us, because we have to compartmentalize a lot of our emotions when interacting with people on a day-to-day basis, with patients on a day-to-day basis, and we have to be able to sort of hear difficult things and hear difficult stories and still move on and see the next patient, or still move on and write the next paper. But in doing that compartmentalization, we lose connection sometimes with people, and I think that's probably the key thing that needs to be taught to people in medical school, because I don't think you really have to. I don't know that you can necessarily teach compassion, and I don't know that people don't come into the field as compassionate individuals, but they do lose that ability to really negotiate their emotions and their feelings and their responses to things that are difficult with taking care of the patient. And I think people lose that, and that's one of the things that we need to do more of.
Absolutely. Great points. So we're gonna have one more question before we go out to social media. We have a couple of questions that have been tweeted at us. And once again, if you are watching us, you can follow us on Twitter at AIDS_United and tweet us questions that you have for our panelists today. Last question I want to ask is really connected to your research, all of your research and your work, of course. But for Dr. Fields, I know that a lot of your work is done navigating what we call biological fluids, the desire for connection and kind of intimacy. And so we're really curious to hear from you to talk a little bit about how, elaborating also with David's point, how does HIV prevention in this current kind of model intersect or talk to or even address the fact that a large part of our desires for intimacy, the biological kind of desire to feel each other's fluids, feel each other's body parts, how does that intersect with and impact the current model of the ways in which HIV prevention is being done?
That's a great question. I think part of my response to that kind of harkens back to what David was saying earlier about the connections we've seen between sexual networks and risk. So to start off with, I think a lot of people are sort of under the misunderstanding that Black people have more HIV because we're having more risky sex. I mean, risky sex meaning not wearing condoms as much as others, and that's absolutely not true. Actually, there's lots of data that suggests that Black men who have sex with men have less risky, quote-unquote, risky behavior. So everyone, this desire to sort of be close to your partner and desire to not use condoms is not unique to Black men, it's universal. And I think part of what we need to do is just acknowledge that. And I think, as I said before, I think PrEP is one of the opportunities we have to acknowledge that. But I think we also, I think each of us, I don't want to take us back to the individual behavior, but I think it is important for us as Black men to really be able to talk about our desires and talk about the things that we want within our sexual partnerships. I mean, I think far too often, in general, and I think this is again not specific to Black men at all, but in general, we sort of act on our what we want to do and act on our needs, but not necessarily discuss those things with our partner, and really have those open conversations with our partners. Again, it's not really a matter of necessarily doing that to prevent HIV, but really more as a way of building our relationships and building our intimacy and building our ability to connect with one another by really speaking our emotions and talking about our emotions and feelings and wants and desires.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. David and Darnell, did you have anything you wanted to share with that question?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. So we're going to move now to some of our questions that we have on Twitter. The first question I have tweeted at us is, the way people keep addressing HIV for Black people does not appeal to or matter to most Black people. How do we fix this? Big question.
Yikes.
No.
Darnell?
I think there is some truth to that. Part of it has to do with our sort of moral ambiguity, this idea that we're still thinking about HIV as sort of this, as a type of evil, right? Like as this sort of thing that someone gets because of their bad practices, which has something to do with, and I don't want to, let me be clear, let me just say this. I don't want to speak in generalizations because I don't think that all Black people think this way. That there are clear examples of some who absolutely challenge these ideas. But I do notice, for example, HIV criminalization, for example. In all of the talk that happens across the country in this sort of moment of Black Lives Mattering around prison abolition, around addressing decrim of, say, marijuana, and also pushing the state to rethink its policies and practices, HIV criminalization is one of those issues that don't really show up on the advocacy platforms. And one can ask the question, well, why? Is it because of the lack of sort of language or understandings that we may have around HIV? Is it a sort of a moral impasse that we don't want to talk about it? Is it homo and trans antagonism? It could be a combination of those things, but I do know that there needs to be, here's my hope, that we are now existing in a moment where we can use something like Black Lives Matter as a doorway, as an entrance point to really thinking about which Black lives matter when we say that term. And we can be talking about the lives of HIV positive folk, and we can absolutely be talking about all of us who are impacted by HIV as Black folk. And we can specifically start addressing things like HIV criminalization as a type of state violence that's otherwise left off of advocacy agendas.
Right, I agree, and I think it's also kind of a socialization process that Errol was speaking about too in the medical field, and that let's not get it twisted. Who's controlling the purse strings for a lot of the HIV research and interventions? It's not Black people that are predominantly the principal investigators, and that's a problem. So more of us need to be involved in these research studies and to create these research studies, and actually we need to think outside of the, I hate saying outside of the box, just such a cliched phrase, but we have to do different things. So we have to not think that just as academics, as scholars, as activists, we have to go to the NIH, the CDC, the private funders. We need to go ahead and do something. One of my mentees and dear colleagues, Dr. Leo Moore, who's in Los Angeles, we talk about this stuff all the time and just about how long the process is to actually get a grant funded and then to go ahead and get that applied. And he's just starting his academic career. And I remember he said to me, he said, look, he said, I want to do stuff now. So the issue is with social media and with these kind of outlets and with the intersection of activism with Black Lives Matter, like Darnell's saying, and some of the other things, we need to realize that these things don't exist in silos in different compartments. We need to intersect those too. So like people who do urban planning or sociology or anthropology, along with activism, along with public health and medicine, all these have to work together, but it has to come from us because the messages typically, and even still to this day, I still see messages that were geared originally in the epidemic for white gay men. And what a lot of researchers do is they slap some kente cloth on it, put a couple black faces on it, and then say, there, it's Afrocentric, and we can pocket this out. They don't want to take the time to actually do the formative research, to ask black communities, which, by the way, is not monolithic, which is going to be, there's going to be a different, what you do in Alabama is going to be different from what you do in D.C. or in New York City. And so to actually take the time to investigate things, to ask communities what messages would be effective, and then to develop the intervention, or just kind of do some of this stuff on our own and then put it out there to the world, and then the funding we can get afterwards. But some of these things with social media and stuff we can do for free. The problem with public health is that most of them have been like kind of McDonald's interventions, like quick size interventions that don't work, but they get funded millions of dollars and then they fall on their asses. They're not sustainable, they don't empower the community, and they don't do anything for HIV transmission.
Whew. All right. Well, I gotta get my church fan.
And my offering.
I'll take it. Come on. I need a new jet. I'm like Creflo Dollar.
Oh my God.
All right. We have another question. And I guess we might have already addressed some of this question in your responses earlier. The question is, how do we make sure our research and interventions aren't stigmatizing? Do you have any tips? And I'm assuming the kente cloth might be one way to make sure it's not, you're not addressing that issue, but go ahead.
Darnell, I just got through speaking a lot. Go ahead.
I mean, I'm not a researcher in that way, but I think that so I don't know. I mean, my response to this might be a little different, but you know, one of the things that folk do in qualitative research is to be sure of the researcher's subject position. That is, you know, who are the folk that are doing the research, and we have to begin to name that. Name that the fact that that research is actually itself an enterprise, right? So that it's a particular market, and it's a market that is deeply entrenched in some ways in anti-blackness and white racial supremacy and all of these other things, these things that we typically use these fancy languages for, but they're often it's not done often by folk who care deeply about black people. So in so many ways, like that itself becomes another form of traumatization. Like forget the sort of focus on HIV, the fact that this is sort of an anti-black enterprise, typically at the helm of projects focused on black lives should be, it's quite, I don't know, I think that's part of the problem. So how do you do it? I think we need to make space for more black, queer, and trans, gender non-conforming researchers. Of pipelines from colleges as beginning from undergrad to graduate school needs to be developed with the funding sources so that our people can be taught to do research that is sensitive to the needs of black folk, and is done by black folk with the commitment in mind. And let's be clear that you can be black and still have anti-black tendencies, right? So we need more spaces for people to be pipelined into programs such that they can be taught to do ethnographic work and other forms of scientific research in a way that is black affirming.
Yeah, and Yolo, I'll also add on to that. I just think there's ways to do research that are non-traditional, and I think for people who are in the audience that may be looking for answers about how to do this, we don't necessarily have the answers to do it because that has to be found wherever you are in your community. So we have to take it upon ourselves. But one of the things that I will suggest to people is that I've been in the game at like academia, working in the HIV field for like 15 to 17 years, and I can tell you that out of all the publications and presentations and all the other shit that I've done in my life, the two things that people remember me for is one, an open letter I wrote to Oprah Winfrey, and two, an appearance I made on a show on TV One called Black Men Revealed back in 2007. And when I tell you that these things can reach further than most of kind of the publications and the static conferences that we have, a lot of the messages are going out through major media and through social media. And so if we don't bring those public health messages in those venues, in those contexts, they're not going to be heard by the broad range of people, and we're more than likely just going to be preaching to the choir. And I can't agree more with what Darnell said. When I did a research project a number of years ago asking black gay men, do you have a certain preference for your medical providers? Do you want them to be black, white, male, female, same gender loving, heterosexual? A lot of them said just be good. So it's not just a general black and white thing. There are white people that are doing phenomenal research and actually give a shit. And then there are some that aren't. And then there are black people that give a shit. And then there's some black people that I wouldn't want to touch me or any of our communities with additions or as private practitioners. So I think there's a socialization process that goes on in America and then in public health. And America is just the umbrella that does all this. Public health and medicine and research is just a microcosm of anti-black sentiment in the United States. So the question you're asking is, how do we stomp out white privilege and, hard done on an individual where we are. It has to start off small and then expound out. But there may not be a particular answer, because for what may work for me and for the people that I serve here in Philly may not work in Brooklyn or may not work in Baltimore. So you have to look at the area where you are and try to think of something different than the tried or true, public health and research venues.
Wow. Thank you for that. I have to share that, like, throughout this panel, even thus far, I have to stop myself from having like a church hymn and be like, yeah. Very powerful. Thank you. We have 2 more questions from our social media audience. This one is, all panelists describe the challenge for black men loving themselves in a society that does not love black men, especially for young black men. What is the role of older black gay men in passing on strategies for resilience or avoiding strategies that have not been helpful?
Am I going to answer this because I'm the oldest one? Is that what's going to happen here?
That's it.
Errol's question.
So it's going to go me, Darnell, and then Errol. Okay. So what I would say, and I've said this, people that have heard me speak before, is that the intergenerational role of those of us who are older, I just think is absolutely invaluable. There's a lot of younger brothers that I know may not have had fathers or biological fathers or stepfathers or male mentors in their lives, and so they learn from us. And so regardless of what's happening, if we don't take the time to kind of teach and mentor on an individual or a community level, it's going to be problematic. I think the dicey issue with that is there's a lot of kind of transference from both sides. So you have older brothers who are looking for young brothers to be intimate with and kind of guised as mentoring, and then they start screwing their mentees, and that becomes a problem. But then there's also kind of the younger brothers who are looking for a father figure, and they mistake that as kind of a sexual attraction and mistake some of the kindness as kind of somebody wanting to date them. And so it can get a little muddled with that. So I think that's the hardest part of it all, is that we have to be really clear about the role and how important we are in the lives of younger black men, but then also what the younger brothers can teach those of us that are a little bit older, because there's a lot of cross-pollination that can go on between as far as learning and knowledge and mentoring is concerned. But I think whether it's formal or informal, you have to reach out from both sides and see if that works. But I've seen too many situations where it's become kind of a sexual or relationship or an exploitation thing, and that's no different from the heterosexual paradigm where an older brother is kind of preying on power dynamics with a younger woman who may not have the financial needs or other things. There are a lot of parallels with that, and I'm very careful with that, but there's a lot of it going on nowadays, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would definitely have to agree with that. I think with both points of David's statement. I think in general, like, we as black people, that's always been our tradition to sort of to mentor and to kind of teach the ropes to the younger generation, and how really to help the younger folks navigate through the fucked up world that we have that devalues us as people. And so I think I think that's absolutely necessary, and it's something that we should be doing within the same gender loving community as well. But there's certainly those challenges that exist. I had done some work talking to young people about their experiences with using the internet, for instance, and this was a while ago, so it was before sort of the Jacked and Grindr and those type of apps. But really, a lot of times, what they talked about was the fact that they didn't have anybody to really affirm their sexuality, to show them what it meant to be gay, to kind of have that to make them feel like they were normal. And so oftentimes the thing that was the most accessible were these kind of online venues where people went to meet people, and a lot of them talked about wanting to meet people so they could get that information, but then it's sort of turning into something that they weren't necessarily ready for. And so really, I agree that we definitely need to have those connections, those cross-generational connections, but we also have to make sure that young people are protected in those spaces.
Yeah, and I don't have any like much more to offer than what you both did. What I've been thinking about as you were talking though is even the lack of sort of older mentorship I have. So in so many ways, like I've often looked for folk who were older than me to come on as mentors, and oftentimes our relationships were complicated by the traumas that they were also enduring. So in so many ways, I'm thinking to develop a mentorship relationship, it also means that the us who's attempting to engage in the mentor relationship with those who are younger than us, so that even though it's a reciprocal relationship, we got to do the work of doing work on ourselves so that we can be ready for a relationship like that. So when I had older brothers who came into my life who were definitely impacted, they were like riveted by the sort of impact of HIV, particularly on that generation. They brought a lot of trauma into the relationships with them. And it's easy for us to carry traumas into our relationships with those that are younger. And so part of what the challenges I've given myself over the past year and a half is to be a better person so that I can be a better mentor to those I can get in relationship with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This kind of leads into our next question. Have we created a space for Black gay men who were survivors of the early era of HIV and AIDS in the United States, and all of us, specifically as Black gay men, to heal, to mourn our losses, to mourn our community, essentially to mourn that the early epidemic? Have we created a space for that emotional mourning, that transformation, that healing? And if there is if that space does not exist, how do we create those kind of spaces?
Ooh.
I could just say, like, simply, for me, and this is only I don't think we have. In ways that I think, like, the white gay community has been able to develop a type of public empathy around sort of white, gay, males, the impact of HIV on their lives. I mean, there are bona fide spaces you can go to that does things like archive people's stories, that tell you what, the work that they did, not only as activists, but will list names. It's still hard for me, I can't speak for anybody else, to talk about the people that I lost in my life who died in secret. That is, they didn't want people to know their status. So a lot of funerals happened where we never, ever mention HIV. That was never, ever talked about. Now, if that's in my personal life, in so many ways, I feel like there are these breaches where we've never been able to publicly mourn as a quote-unquote community, our communities, Black communities, our list in my friendship circles, the loss in ways that I think is hope that can heal us, in ways that I think actually is true to our life stories and experiences, in ways, and if we don't care about Black death, if you can watch people get shot, Walter Scott get shot, and still have apathy in your heart, you damn sure won't care about any of us that are lost by HIV. So I don't think it's emblematic of the crabs. I think it's, I've been saying this all day, it's the barrel, it's the system.
Right.
I think that we need to proclaim, and maybe, what we can do, insist, if we're again talking about Black Lives Matter, continue to say, well, what fucking Black Lives Matter are you? Whose Black lives are you referencing?
Right.
What about the Black brothers and sisters whose lives have been lost by HIV? And how about we begin to name those publicly as a way to mourn? Mourning is a sign that we're actually human, that we actually have empathy, that we care. And I think to disrupt that apathetic culture is to name and proclaim and lift up all of those that have been lost already.
Yeah, I think with like back in the day, like organizations like Gay Men of African Descent, GMAD, or Second Sunday in Atlanta, the Brothers Network, I believe, in San Francisco, these were all kind of smaller gatherings that were coming out of a place of crisis and death and the concern and the trauma and the emotion of all that. And what's happening right now is that there's kind of this generalized apathy to HIV because we don't see people dying from it as much as we used to. So it doesn't have the sense of urgency that it did at the beginning with Marlon Riggs and Essex Hemphill, where they were striving for their lives. They were living day to day, not knowing if they would make it to the next day. So their work had a sense of urgency, and I think some of that is lacking right now. But the fact of the matter is, especially for a lot of us where our families have not been all too accepting of our sexual orientation, we create our non-biologic families. So whatever we can do to kind of have small groupings, and not just book clubs and stuff like that, but groupings where we really talk about these kind of things. And then also these smaller networks where, how many out of your all groups of friends know that if you were to die or something were to happen to you, do you have a durable power of attorney? Do your parents or your family members know who to call that are your best friends, who are your brothers, not biological, but the brothers you chose because you love them so much and they love you so much? Where are those networks in those small little spaces that if anything happens to us, any kind of trauma, so you can avoid this kind of thing where somebody dies of HIV and somebody's saying gender loving, and you go to the funeral and the pastor just turns it into another offering and then starts speaking platitudes from the Bible, and they don't even they say, oh, well, he loved church and he loved this, but nothing is talked about his whole experience as a black same gender loving man. And if we don't actually create those networks where we can stand up and have the kind of ceremonies, the celebrations, not posthumously, but actually when we're all alive, then when something does happen, we're going to be left with our asses out like that.
I think one of the challenges is really a challenge that I throw back onto the black communities as a whole. I think we as black gay men have a responsibility to kind of carry the torch, but I also think that our heterosexual brethren have the same responsibility. I grew up in a very rural Southern Christian community, and the pastor of my church, the current pastor of my church, also from a very similar background. But he had a sermon in this church. I wasn't there. My mother told me about it. But this sermon in the church, rural South, like I said, very conservative area, talking about HIV and talking about why it's important that we all, as a people, care about this. Not that it's not, not focusing, but that really, like, as a community, we have to be able to uplift all the members of our community and really have respect and compassion for all the members of our community. Because I think as black people, we are much more closely tied to our other black brothers and sisters than the sort of the white gay community might be. And speaking in generalities, of course, but I think one of the reasons why we don't we're not necessarily part of that movement is because that's not where our home is, and our home is within the black community. I think in order for that home to be a safe space for us, we really need to push others in the community to really have our back when it comes to that as well.
Amazing. Gentlemen, this has been a dynamic conversation and panel. I'm really honored to have shared this space with you today. There's a lot of takeaways, I'm sure, for the audience, a lot of takeaways for me. I know some of the things that will resonate is the call to emotional health and the need to establish and address emotional health and trauma. Dr. Fields, when you were talking about earlier about how we love black men, we love each other. We love each other through and beyond these traumas and these different things that we're kind of being impacted by. And so I want to take some time to thank you all for your time and your energy and for what you've shared today. This has truly been inspirational. I know a lot of people who are watching it are being empowered to do their work, and I hope that as you're watching, you also support these brilliant men and their work that they are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we close out, I want to invite you all. This conversation continues. Of course, this video will be available on our Age United Google Hangout page. So if you want to watch this video, share with other people, please feel free to do so. You can also continue to contact us and reach out to us through Facebook and Twitter. We will take your feedback. We want to hear your thoughts and your perspective that will inform future conversations. Our next panel, as a part of the series, will be called "Honoring Our Faith: Bridging Belief in HIV." That date will be announced soon, and once again, will be a dynamic panel having critical conversations like this one. I want to say thank you all on behalf of Age United. Thank you so much for your time and your brilliance. It has been a great panel. Everyone out there, thank you for participating. Have a great day.
Bye.